All right, welcome everybody to Destreza Lecture Series, lecture number 30. And it's sort of a milestone for us. We've been doing this for almost a year now, and our first lecturer is back to give us his Destreza book report on Pacheco Grandeza. So just as a word of warning, it's become a tradition at the Destreza Lecture Series to take a drink whenever anybody says something negative about Pacheco. If you do that in this lecture, you might die. So Tim Rivera is not responsible for your untimely death, and we also disavow any unresponsible drinking behavior. So everybody here knows who Tim is, I think. So I'm just going to get out of his way and let him start talking.
Okay, thanks, Buck. I am trying to share something, so let me know when you can see it.
I can see it.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to be talking about Pacheco's first book, which is Grandeza de la Espada, which a lot of you know, as Buck kind of alluded to, I'm not a big fan of Pacheco, but a lot of people ask me, so why do you read so much Pacheco, and why do you translate so much Pacheco if you hate him so much? The thing is that it's very hard to avoid Pacheco, but more importantly, he's very important to what Destreza became, and so especially with this book. So some of what we're going to talk about, you know, it's a little bit. It may not be as structured as you're used to, because you have to remember this is very early on in the Destreza tradition. So a lot of people, when they get into it, they jump into different authors at different times, and even if the author doesn't have their own unique spin on it, you know, it's at a certain time the art has been developed certain ways or not. And so this is very, very early. Here's a couple covers. So this was printed multiple times. The first one was on the left. That's in the year 1600. And that is, to put it in perspective, the only manuscript that we have of vulgar styles Godinho, and that was written in 1599. So this is right about the same time. This was approved. Some of the approvals were from 1599, but it's actually dated 1600. And at the end of the book, he dates it with 1600. So he promises in this book to declare a lot of the secrets that Carranza had written about, but didn't spell out completely. So this he's saying that you can learn this, and you don't need a master to teach you it. So just to kind of give us some more context, Carranza's book was published in 1582. It was written earlier than that. I think it was 69, maybe. But that is almost 20 years before Pacheco published his book. Pacheco's book, Grandeza, is the first book after Carranza wrote his book. So there was a big span of time. Carranza's book was published in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is way down south by Seville. Pacheco, his book was published in Madrid, but he was a sergeant major in the army down in the Canary Islands. So there's a little map there just in case people are geographically challenged to show where things are. This is important because when this was published, 1600, Carranza was already retired. He had already gone to the New World, you know, become governor of Honduras, and then he retired, and he's living in Guatemala now. Probably, I don't think we know exactly when he died, but he's probably still alive at this point. But he's gone. He's out of the picture. This is the first kind of technical book that was written on Destreza. And so with that in mind, Pacheco says why he wrote this book. And the important thing is that Carranza wrote a lot about theory, and anybody who's actually read Carranza's book or even part of it knows that it's a classic dialogue, and there's not a lot of technical information in there. There's very little, but a lot of it's just theory and philosophy. So Pacheco is saying that that Carranza wrote profound theory. And he says that in the book, he says that he had been keeping notes on it, studying it, and kind of created a small volume over the course of about 2 weeks. And he just kept it in his desk. He worked on it in his free time when he wasn't performing military exercises. And the whole reason it came about is because some friends had noticed it and pestered him to see it, and he didn't want to show them. But he eventually relented and showed them, but only wanted to show them in private, didn't want to make it public. And so then he did, and they took a break, and they finally convinced him to actually get it written up so that it could be published. So that's how the book came about. We don't really know when Pacheco was born. There's a guess that it's about 1570, which means he was roughly 30 when this book was written, which means that he was about 20 when he started to look into this. So, and those are rough. We don't know exactly what his age was. But I just wanted to point out the fact that, so there's sometimes people will say, Pacheco. Read his book, had some fencing knowledge already, and studied the book and tried to put it into practice. So there's a lot of things in here that Pacheco originated or possibly originated.
Yes.
Tim, we lost some of the audio on what you were saying. Could you restate some of that?
This book, it's hard to overstate the importance of this book. It's a very long book. It's including all the front matter and the indices and everything. It's about 700 pages long. I think it's about as long as Pacheco's last book, New Science. I mean, Nueva Ciencia beats it on word count, but page-wise, they're about the same. And this stayed as a very important work that was referenced for decades. There are authors that wrote in the late 1630s and 1640s that are still referencing this book. And Nueva Ciencia, which is his other book, didn't actually get published until 1470 or something. Really late, way after he had already died. And so this is basically his foundational, his seminal work. He had some other things that he wrote, but this was just kind of out of the blue. He didn't want to show it to people privately or publicly, but especially publicly, because he was afraid of the ridicule that he would receive from people. Because he said that if someone as great as Carranza had written his book and he got ridiculed by censors, what would they say about Pacheco? So a lot of times we look backwards at it, and Pacheco's the great man, and he was wrote all of this stuff, and he defined the tradition and became mayor and changed everything. But at the time that this was written, he was maybe 30 years old, and he had spent about 10 years studying Carranza's book and decided he was going to write this 700-page book and publish it. So I don't mean to say that to demean Pacheco, even though I do like to me and Pacheco. You don't want to pass up an opportunity to do so. But to look at it that way, if you think about it as kind of a positive, this was just some guy, you know, who studied Carranza for 10 years and decided he was going to write a book. And here we are 400 years later still studying this book. So he had a little bit of sensing knowledge. He studied for about 10 years and put this out. If he can do that, and he was afraid of people, you know, ridiculing him, criticizing his work, then think about that the next time that any of you want to put something out there and, you know, are afraid that maybe you don't know enough, or you're not good enough, or you're afraid of what people are going to say. Just think back to Pacheco, you know, 30-year-old Pacheco who had studied for 10 years and decided to write a book, and it's, you know, a classic, and it's been around. So don't get discouraged about that. And if you're friends with anybody and you see that they're being discouraged, encourage them, like Pacheco's friends did.
Hey,
Okay.
Tim.
So for this book,
Tim, the volume is still.
Zoom into various parts and discuss them in a little bit more detail, because it is, like I said, it's a very large book, and there's no way we can go through everything. It's, one, it's tedious, and two, it would just take forever. So he divides it into 5 parts. First part is the foundation, which is mostly kind of philosophy and theory. The second part is a little bit more technical. So he just shows the kind of basic things that people already know, the first kind of things that you would show somebody, you know, right angle stance, things like that, in order to discuss the particulars. So in the third part and the fourth part is where he gets into all his particulars, and he has his demonstrations of all the floating swords and the lines and such. So the third part, he has the counters to the ordinary Destreza. So he's very just kind of picking them apart. He's not really telling you how to fence, just telling you how to beat other people. And then the fourth part, he's telling you how to fence, how you should fence. And then in the the fifth part, he talks about some points that you need for the universe. So this is a big idea that comes up a lot. Carranza talks about it, other authors talk about it. They say that science doesn't deal with particulars, science deals with universals. So the idea is not to know particular fencing or what to do in a particular situation, to give you a more universal knowledge and sense and understanding of movements and how things work, so that you can handle whatever situation that you end up in.
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
Kind of setting that theoretical and then practical foundation. And then from there, he works from more specific into more universal. The third part, you know, these are the things that the common and vulgar fencers like to do, and here's how you beat them, and then here's a more general way of how you should fence. And then finally, here's the more universal things that you need to know in order to fence properly.
Ditto.
So the first part consists of these things. He's got his prologue, where his prologue to the reader, he just spends some time talking about why this is a science. And it's basically the same stuff that you read in pretty much any book. It's not terribly interesting, so we're going to blow right by it. The epistle that he writes to his friend is explaining all the things that I explained already at the beginning on why he wrote this book and how it came about. And he's actually humble when he writes this letter to his friend, which is kind of shocking. And it's an interesting read, because if you read that, his last book, it's like a totally different person. But he talks about why he did it, and talks about how he had to do it essentially because of friendship. He couldn't deny his friend. So that's all translated for anybody who doesn't speak Spanish. You can go find that. Then he has this foundational part of the science. So he says that it rests on two foundations, and those two foundations are truth and other sciences. And for the other sciences, he gives math and natural philosophy. Those are really the only ones that he talks about, even though later on he talks about other sciences that contribute to it or have a part in it. For right now, he just talks about math and natural philosophy. And the interior and exterior elements, those are basically the physical and mental or spiritual qualities that you should have as a practitioner of science. And then the elements that a master and disciple. So in those particular roles, this is the type of person that you're looking for. And then he has a judgment on authorship. So the one of the things that's interesting about this is the interior and exterior elements that he talks about. So with these exterior elements, they're essentially just body type. So that, you know, how long your eyebrows should be, and, you know, what proportion your arms should be in, and that kind of thing. This is purely physical type of person that is best suited to this science. And a lot of it's based on old classical ideas about body types and everything that entails. And then the interior elements, these he lists 5 of them that are important. There's nothing really interesting that he says about them to me. I mean, they're all positive qualities. Everybody can understand why those are good things to have. Spirit being kind of a braveness and animation, you know, being a spirited person, not necessarily like anything spiritual or religious. So I'm not going to go into details about those. The elements of the master and the disciple, the master is not terribly interesting as well. It's things that you would expect. You know, the master has to be honest. He has to teach a student true. He shouldn't, you know, take advantage of him, things like that. And then the disciple also should be, you know, should honor their master and should listen to what they say and practice what they say and defend their honor and all the basic kind of stuff. There are a few interesting things that he says about a disciple. So the starting age, the ideal starting age for someone to learn this is between 18 and 25. That's just the way it is. He doesn't really explain much. I mean, he just wants you to be between this age. That's ideal. And then there are certain things that he thinks that you should be used to. That, you know, you should have the physical capabilities of having a certain type of athleticism and coordination before you start trying to do any kind of sword play. So running, jumping, bar throwing. I'm not sure exactly what bar throwing is. Best I can find is the game that children play where they throw bars. And it's kids back in the 16th century. I don't know what they did for fun, but throwing bars sounds like something to do. He says that's important for strength and, you know, having the natural resilience to be able to throw the sword around all day. Playing ball, again, he doesn't say what type of ball game it is. I don't know. But it presumably has something to do with catch, because he talks about natural and violent motions that you make and kind of tracking the motion of a ball and when it's going to fall and where it's going to fall and things like that. Because it's having to do with being able to track motion and hand-eye coordination. And then playing an instrument and dancing, that's important because those are both associated with music, and so it's about rhythm and consonance and trying to make sure that you can coordinate your body and your with that rhythm. He also does say that it is advantageous to have weighted shoes. So shoes with some lead in between the layers of the sole. Walk around with weighted shoes all day, and you get used to hauling those things around. And then when you go to actually do something, you put on normal shoes, and then you're suddenly pressed there because you feel like you just float around everywhere, and possibly get so. He goes into great detail describing things that he wants are ideal. And so I pulled out a lot of the characteristics that he had for an ideal disciple or the type of person for this science, and kind of typed them up into this personal ad for Pacheco and describing his ideal disciple. So for those of you that are too young to remember this, back before there was an internet, there were these things called newspapers, which was like the printout, something you get on your printer, but people would bring it to you and had the news in it. And inside that there were ads, and some of these ads were personal ads. This was before Tinder or dating apps, and you actually had to put things in the newspaper and people would read them and then get back to you. So these are the characteristics that Pacheco says are ideal. He wants you to have medium stature and a proportionate body. So most of the things he goes into detail talking about, but usually he just says, well,
early hair.
You should have a proportionate sized head. It shouldn't be too big, it shouldn't be too small. And then he moves on to your forehead. Your forehead should be smooth, but otherwise it should be proportionate. So a lot of it he just says, don't be all out of whack. But for some reason he wants you to have curly hair. Curly-haired people are better with science. I don't know why. He does say that people of a large stature just don't really get science. They're just too fleshy. There's just too much meat, and they can't get it. He wants you to have a thick voice. You can have a
medium stature.
Voice,
medium stature.
Voice. That's bad. You want a wide back. Long and strong fingers. He says this is important for holding the sword. You need that. Lean abdomen, muscular thighs, shapely calves. I have no idea what lean feet is all about, but he doesn't want people to have chunky feet for some reason. That's going to get in the way. I've never thought to describe someone's feet as being lean or not. They seem like feet to me, but hey, whatever. And you should be from a temperate province, because hot inclined things come from hot provinces, and then cold inclined things come from cold provinces. So you want temperate, so then you have a balance of those. And then all of the exercises and things that he wants you to have. Okay, so after that he talked about a little bit about teaching. And so he wants you to teach in the morning because your brain is still wet from sleep. You don't want to do it in the evening because it's dried out during the day. And I guess when you go to sleep, your brain marinates itself or whatever. It's something to do with emergent things I don't really quite understand. But it is interesting because he says that customarily people will teach in the evening. He thinks that it should be done in the morning, and that's something that Viedma kind of talked about as well. Talked about that he had been teaching at night, not necessarily that was a normal thing, but this is kind of interesting that Pacheco is saying that most of the time people teach in the evening. And then he talks about the four complexions, the four types of people, four temperaments, and how you should teach them. So his theory is that you should teach according to their temperament, that you should not go against their nature. So if someone is choleric, then you should teach them first attention attacks right away and go with that. And for the sanguine, you should use the acometimiento, and phlegmatic, second intention, And the melancholy, he just really, Pacheco does not like the melancholy. They're just completely useless to him every time you talk to them. But if you do have to teach someone who's melancholy, since they're not going to attack anyway, and they're not going to really do anything, then just teach them do the atajo so at least they don't get stabbed. And then hopefully they will learn to not be so awful, and then they can learn to do other things. But this is his kind of roadmap for how you should teach your student. Okay, so that's the first part. Second part is where he gets into the more technical foundation, and this is some of the things that are a little bit more familiar to people. Talks about how you should position yourself, the mean of proportion, how to do steps, circles of the arm, chord and arc, right angle, kind of geometric things, and then the timing of before, during, and after. The position that he shows, this is the thing that everybody sees. These are the first, some of the first drawings that he has in his book. Over on the left, you've got the circle with the inscribed square that is similar to what's in Carranza's book, and then he has the feet there that how you should be positioned at right angles. So, little known fact, Pacheco had gigantic feet, and here's the proof right here in front of you. Can't argue with that. It's just science. And also, it should be noted that Pacheco had a hard time telling his left from his right, so his mom had to write left foot and right foot on his shoes. So you can see that if you don't read Spanish, it's pie derecho and pie izquierdo is what's written inside the footprints there. I'm joking, of course, none of that's true. I don't know why the feet are gigantic, and he felt the need to write inside them, and then he made the circle so small, but there it is. And over on the right, you have a fully clothed man. He also has a naked man in the exact same position. So you can see how he says that the naked guy is there so that you can see exactly how his body is positioned. And then he shows you the clothed guy because you should be doing it with clothes on. He does say that, don't take your cloak off, don't take your dagger off, don't take your hat off. Customary for people when they go to train that you should take all of those off, but he says no, you should train with all of those on. And that's part of why he has this guy pictured in this position. So something that's kind of interesting. So Thibault has talked about this before. I think he talked about it in his lecture. If not, he's written something up about it. How the swords are gripped. So Pacheco is very specific about how the sword should be gripped. He says that you want the index finger over the cross, basically, and you come back around. And it's very important that you have your thumb locked over your other forefinger. So it's not really shown very well in that drawing, but he is very specific about it in the text because that's very important. The thumb is there locking the other fingers down. Okay, this is the choosing of the mean of proportion. So at the top, you've got equal swords. Make sure it doesn't come past the cross. And the middle one is how you should choose it if you have the shorter sword. And the bottom one is how you should choose it if you have the longer sword. So in all of these, the bottom one, if you notice the guard's on the wrong spot, I kind of flipped it around so that all of the correct choices are on the left. So the DSO would be on the left, and it's the time you choose it. So just basically make sure that tip doesn't go past your cross or comes to your cross, and that's how it's done. So this is interesting because Carranza never gives directions on how to choose the mean of proportion. This appears to be something that Pacheco invented. He does have justification for it in some of the wording that Carranza gives, Carranza says that choosing the mean of proportion is the same as measuring the sword. That's all he says. So if you take it literally, that's what's happening right here. But again, Carranza never says how to do it or what the correct mean is. He just says that it's different for different size weapons and things like that. So this is the first actual, hey, here's what it is, here's what it's supposed to be. Yeah. Okay, steps. So Pacheco goes nuts with steps because, again, this is not something that Carranza lays out in detail. Carranza to some extent, but also definitely Pacheco is trying to tie this into the science of stepping, which is basically it's cosmography. And it's how you measure something off by just kind of pacing it off. So they've measured, you know, like this is how far a step is, this is how far a pace is, and these are different types. So he's trying to tie that into it, and he has about 6 different types of steps that you can make, and he has the distance for all of them. It goes everywhere from 2 feet all the way out to 6 feet. And the way that he talks about them is kind of a confused mess, so I'm not going to try to discuss them or lay them out because really they're not that important, and they're a little bit confusing because of the way that the naming works. But he does say that in the cosmography, when they are measuring something out, they will take a step first with their right foot, and then they will step with their left, and then step with their right again afterwards. Do not do that in Destreza, that you have to always have that good posture of your feet. So you'll take a step with the right foot, and then the left follows, and then that's it. Stays there, comes to that good posture again, and then you take another step with the right foot. So it further confuses what he's doing. But something of note about this is that when he talks about the length of the step, whether they need to be, 2 feet, 3 feet, whatever, he does allow for different size bodies and different size people, and says that the length of a foot needs to be proportionate to the stature of the person. So those of you short fencers can rejoice in this. That he says that a foot should be 1/6 of your height. So if you are 6 feet tall, then you got a standard foot, even though their foot is slightly shorter than an American foot. It should be 1/6 of your height, and so that is the measure that you should use. But then he kind of prevaricates and says that, well, where you should actually be stepping completely depends on your opponent and what's going on. So you can kind of just throw, he doesn't say you can throw all this out the window, but I'm saying you can throw it all out the window because it gives you all these precise measurements for how to step and everything. And says, yeah, but it just depends on what's going on. So I'm not even going to try to discuss it. Okay, so then these 3 are the demonstrations that he has on some of the principles, some of the geometric principles. They should be familiar to anybody who's familiar with Destreza. They, over on the left, you've got the 3 circles of the arm, so that's whether it's centered on the wrist or on the elbow or on the shoulder. And the shoulder is the largest one, centered on the elbow is the middle one, and then centered on the wrist is the smallest one. And that's kind of the way that they talk about shorter movements, even though the movements are the same depending on where they're done. So you can do something with the wrist, and it will, even if it's larger or it covers more area than circular area, and what something with the shoulder would do, it'll still beat it, still get there first. Same thing with the arc and the chord in the middle. And he's basically just showing that, the straight line is shorter than the curved line from one point to another point. And finish the letters on there, kind of showing that the chord is a diameter, and the part is something that's is going to be a passage as long as the diameter, which is about how it works out. So 2 parts to the diameter, 3 parts to the circumference. And then the last one is the right angle, and that's the proof that the right angle reaches farther than the obtuse or the acute angle. So nothing really new there. Those are the basics that he introduces so that you can understand what he's going to be talking about later. So the other thing that he has at the very end of the second part is he discusses the how to interpret the demonstrations that he's going to show in the 3rd and 4th and 5th parts of his book. And so that's something I'm going to talk about in a little bit of detail when we get into the 3rd part. But it's something that people have asked. Is the third part of the book has been translated for a while now, and some of the people didn't really understand what the demonstration was showing. And it's not because Pacheco doesn't say how to interpret it, it's just in the end of the 2nd part rather than the beginning of the 3rd part, so that part's not translated yet. Okay, 3rd part. This is where he really gets into the meat of the sentence. And these are the most common techniques that the vulgar senses, the common senses do. Some of these will seem familiar. Everybody's familiar with the list of 30 that Pacheco has. That list of Resistencia, that's his last work. And it's kind of followed his different works through time. He built up to that list of 30. Started off with a much smaller list. I believe.
Starting to lose it again.
His 2nd book that he wrote, the In Conclusion. And so some of these are in there, some of them are not, some of them kind of dropped off. The 30 is just kind of famous because that's the last one, but this is the early iteration of things that he talks about. So we're going to hit each of these and just kind of run through them quickly so that people get an idea, feel for what the demonstrations are like. So first one is Iron Gate. So in Spanish, this is Puerta de Hierro, which is the same as the Italian Porta de Ferra, which is just having the sword with the point up and the hilt low and sitting out in front of you, the natural way that people will hold a sword when you give them a sword and stand in front of them with another sword. They just put it in between. So the way that he organizes the demonstrations is that he will have a set of them. So they're like each demonstration. So here he has 4 of them. There's the first one, which is in the upper left, and then the subsequent ones are on the bottom left, right. He introduces the technique at first, talks a little bit about it, and then we'll talk about how to counter it, and then continuation of that. You do this, they counter it this way, so you do this other thing, you do it this way, so then they do this other thing. So the first demonstration, you'll notice, has these paths that are drawn on the floor. So these paths represent the totality of what he's going to be talking about for this section. So there's A, B, C, D, and E all in the first one. And if you go look down at the second one, it's just A, B. And then on the third one, he has D, and then on the last one, he has point E. So he gives you this kind of layout with the footwork at the very beginning. And even though this first one, he only talks about what you do going from A to B. And then in the next demonstration, he shows you go to C. So the swords are going to be roughly in the positions that he describes happening at the time. The 2 concentric circles represent the opponent. So in this case, this is the vulgar fencer who is in this iron gate position. The way to think about this is that roughly it's a top-down view. So you've got a bird's eye view of what's happening here. So from A to B is stepping straight into the opponent, and then B to C, they step to the left, to the diestro's left. A lot of times, it's not always there, but usually he has a D on the pommel of the diestro's sword to identify which is which. Not always there, but occasionally it is. The swords are not always viewed from above. Sometimes they're viewed from the side, or sometimes they're viewed from other angles. So it's just kind of however he decided to represent that relationship between the swords in this two-dimensional top-down view of what's happening here. It's kind of a way to help you understand the relationship between the swords. So with this one, when the vulgar fencer is in iron gate, you step straight forward, A to B, and thrust them straight in the chest, right along the diameter. So a lot of times people will say when they're introducing people to Destreza, you should never go straight down the diameter. That's like a number one thing that Pacheco tells you to do, straight down the diameter and stab the guy in the chest. So depending on the author and the time period, that may not be correct. So that's number one. The second one in the lower left, the opponent lifted his sword to try to counter this thrust to the chest. So you are going to throw your sword below and stab him below the arm. And that's what that representation of the swords are there. Then in third one, center bottom, when they drop their sword in order to prevent being stabbed in the chest, you are going to step in, give a circular step, putting in the left foot, and give a reverse to the head, subjecting their sword hand with your left hand. So typically we call this a movement of conclusion. Pacheco never uses the term movement of conclusion in this book. At least I didn't see it. This is kind of an example of, we're going to get into more later, where the terminology is very fluid. And so the idea of movement of conclusion is not something that he has come up with yet. Even though it may seem foundational, it at this point is not. So every time he refers to this, he refers to subjecting the opponent's sword, or subjecting their sword hand with your hand, rather than making a movement of conclusion. So that one, step in, make a movement of conclusion, which is subjecting the sword hand, and give the reverse to the head. So if you fail in that, and they lift to come to parry that blow, so you don't actually successfully subject their sword with your hand, and they go to parry, then you're going to step back along that line. It's kind of hard to see in the lower right, but fortunately you have the very first one that shows you the path that you should be taking. This kind of a backward step and thrust below their arm again. And so this is what he has for how to defeat the Iron Gate. In these 4 chapters, each chapter is headed by one of these demonstrations, and he talks about that piece of the sequence that happened. So before I go any further, is there anybody that doesn't understand this? Because that'll make the rest of the demonstration hard to follow.
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
If so, speak up. Otherwise, I'm just speaking.
Tim, can you hear what we're saying?
Okay. Next is the sword crossing the chest. So I'm not going to go through in detail like I did with the other one, because that was just to kind of demonstrate the way that these demonstrations are laid out. I just want to talk a little bit about each one, because it's a little interesting, and then it'll also help later talking about certain things. So sword across the chest is literally just, you have your sword, they have their sword across their chest. So instead of having it kind of forward with the point up like they do in the Iron Gate, somebody say something?
Can you hear us, Tim? Jim? We're having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, okay.
And we've tried to ask a couple questions, but you couldn't hear us, it seemed like.
Oh, hang on. Let me try and fix something. How about now?
Yeah, that's pretty good. It sounded like you might all like just backing away from your mic.
Okay.
So we could pay attention to that too.
All right. Is this better?
Sounds good to me.
That's good.
Okay, good.
We did have a question from the chat though, Tim. First person who used the term conclusion, if Pacheco didn't use it in this book.
I think he used it in his second book. I think he used it in Conclusiones, but if not, he definitely used it by Motafasi. I think that was his third book. So yeah, I mean, it was definitely Pacheco. Pacheco invented that term, but I don't know which book exactly he started using it in.
Okay, cool.
I'd have to check. Okay, so sorry if I just talked over everybody's questions. I apparently couldn't hear what was happening. So were there any other questions that I missed?
No, we just drank instead.
Oh, sweet, that works.
Oh,
Okay,
there was another question, Tim.
Yes.
The conclusion in the previous plate, that was on the reverse, is that right?
Right.
Right. And just looking at it, I can see if you have hold of their hilt, you could try to go under the weapon, but I think you're probably going to have to go around and over the top of it. So you grab the hilt
yes.
and a full circular reverse to the head.
Right.
Okay, that's what I'm saying
I think
too.
the implication is that with the subjection of the sword with your hand is that it's kind of a downward pressing of their sword. So the revés would have to circle around. He talks about it a little bit later, how the reveses and the tajos are given. But typically he calls them circular techniques. And with these techniques, they're usually like a full circle. So when he describes them, it's, the point starting from right angle, point drops, and it will go past your thigh. So if you're right-handed and you're giving a revés, it's going to go past your right thigh and then circle around over your head and come down and cut with the backhand. So it's a big circular cut. And so in this case, you were thrusting below their arm, and they tried to hit the sword downward in order to parry that. And so you're going to circle from underneath all the way around and then cut them in the head. Okay, so the sword crossing the chest, this is just holding the sword. He doesn't specify the exact angle, but it's just across your chest. It could be horizontal or diagonal or whatever, but the point is not forward. So with this, he wants you to take a circle step left, cross them below the arm. When they try and parry that down, you're going to continue, and you're going to do a blow of a whole circle, which is something he defines and talks about later. But he just names it here, and it's just creating a circle with your point coming all the way back around over the top of their sword so you can thrust in. Then, when they try to lift or parry with their sword, you're going to step back to the right. And this one, he has kind of a branch. So the previous one, there was just one path going all the way through, but this one branches off from C to either D or E. And so these are basically options. So when he comes into parry, you can either go to D and give the tajo, or you can go to E and give a thrust to the chest. So he's kind of showing there that You need to be a little bit closer for the cut than you do for the thrust. So in these, in the demonstration for the thrust to the chest, the very last one, you won't have that fast to D. It'll just be A to B to C, then to E. Because that's the way he shows it. That's kind of an option. You can go either way.
And with all of these, Tim, it looks like he's completing each step with both feet. Like there's nothing about like shifting weight to one foot and then moving the other direction.
No, he's very adamant. The only time that's not true, well, it's still true, when he steps into subject with the left hand. He says that the left foot comes in, but even when you do that, you're going to maintain the same profile and position of the body that you would on the right, just it's going to be reversed. So he still wants you to profile your body when you step in to do the conclusion or subject the sword with your hand. But the right will follow the left and come in. And I believe he's not really explicit about why that is, but he does reference it. There's a demonstration, one of the few demonstrations that Carranza has in his book, as he talks about how to hold the weight and how you should have how far apart your feet should be and where your weight should be positioned, to basically say, don't have them too far apart and don't have them too close together. So have about a foot or whatever between them. And have your weight evenly distributed. Yes.
Sorry, we have another question here. Does Pacheco land his thrust when the front foot lands or when the back foot lands when you take your step, or does he vary between the two?
I couldn't say for certain. I know in at least one point, he says that it should be that all the actions finish at the same time. So, well, a lot of times he says that, but one of the times specifically when he's talking about delivering a thrust. So the implication to me is that that should be when the left foot lands rather than when the right foot lands. And looking at some of these distances where he talks about wounding, like I don't know how you would do it when the right foot lands if your left foot is way back unless you're leaning very far forward. And that's something that he says is a no-no you shouldn't do. Okay, so that's the sword crossing the chest. Inviting. This one is, he says that the previous one was a type of inviting. So having the sword across the chest, what they're trying to do is get you to stab at them so that they can deflect it and thrust you or whatever. This is another form of it. And he says that typically what they do is they'll throw a Tahoe that will not complete. It won't, it's not intended to connect. It's just there to create an opening. So they're going to throw the Tahoe so that the sword goes to the left and low, because they're trying to invite the thrust in over the sword. And when that happens, then they'll do their most celebrated technique, which is to turn nails down and thrust in, putting in the left foot. So Pacheco's counter to this, or his way of dealing with the inviting, is to give them exactly what they want. So you step straight in, A to B, stab at them, and then knowing what they're going to do, because somehow you know what they're going to do. This is one of the, I'm going to start talking bad about Pacheco now. So a lot of times he will give you a something, and he'll give you the counter, and this is what you should do. And he talks about having this kind of, I believe the term is a strange readiness or a strange awareness of what's going to happen. So because you are the diestro, and because you have studied, and because you understand movements and how they all relate to each other, you will just kind of know what's going to happen or not going to happen, and so therefore you can take advantage of that. He even does that when he's talking about fighting with somebody else, when they're doing things that they're supposed to be doing. So I don't know how that's supposed to work if the other person also has the spidey senses. It just, you're just Pacheco, so it works. I don't know. But anyway, that's what happens here. So they invite you to thrust, and then you thrust at them, and somehow it doesn't go poorly for you. So when they come up to take your sword, you take a circular step to the right, and again, you give either the tajo or the thrust to the chest, depending on what you like, and then there are your two paths right there. Okay, this one is fantastic because there's only one chapter for it. It is the acometimiento with a cut. So he says that the vulgars do this, and they raise their sword high, and they start screaming and making faces at you, and they try and come down and cut at you. And all you really have to do, take a circular step to the left and stab them before they cut. Done. That's it. So not anything else to say there. Okay. Testing the sword. So this one is one that if you've read Godinho, it shows up a lot. And this is something that later on in Nueva Ciencia, Pacheco talks about and says that this is a very characteristically Spanish thing to do.
This is
So
Tentado.
what it is? Yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, I didn't put any of the Spanish on these. But what this is, for those who aren't familiar, the vulgar fencer is going to take the weak part of his sword, the last third, and he's going to press slightly against your sword in order to feel what you're doing. And then I think the way that Pacheco describes it is that they will just circle off of that free below and go to thrust because they assume you're going to push back. Doesn't really matter what the person's trying to do because Pacheco is just going to interrupt them anyway and win. So you have three different options here of what to do when somebody tries to test your sword by slightly pressing the weak of their sword against yours. Number one is circle left and give the blow of the whole circle. So similar to what he did before. You can't see on these because he forgot to label the C and the D, but C is the step along the diameter and D is the circular step to the right. So it goes B, C, and D from bottom to top. So the other thing that you can do when they test your sword is just run right at them and stab them in the chest. And then the last thing that you can do is step over to D, which is the circular step to the right, and subject the sword. So this is another part where Pacheco rarely, not very often, does not use the word atajo when we would normally talk about it and say that it's atajo. He says to subject the sword. So essentially what it is it's placing atajo on the inside of his sword, but it's not the wording that he gives. He says subject the sword. And then from there you can follow up with the tajo, or you can follow with a thrust that has been turned to the extreme of nails up so that you do not lose contact with their sword. All of those are the counters to testing. The opponent doesn't even get to do anything other than start to test, and then here's your three options, and there's nothing else that you need to know from this, apparently. Okay, punching thrust. This is another one that is pretty interesting. So for those who want the Spanish, this is the tocada de puño, the punching thrust. He only gives one thing, and that is to do a circular step to the right and subject the sword. But this time he says subject the sword with a universal impediment, which is, like, I can't imagine what that is other than atajo, but he doesn't use the word atajo for this. I'm not sure why. But it is essentially atajo. Maybe he just had a thesaurus and wanted to make use of it, or what, I don't know. But that's his answer. Place the universal impediment on their sword, and then you can, do the thrust or the cut just like you did previously. So the next one is the arrebatar tajo, which this technique, for those who aren't familiar with it, the vulgar fencer is going to take their sword underneath the diestro sword and beat it up into the air, and then use that motion to come down with a tajo. So if any of you are familiar with Godinho, this is essentially ripping with a tajo, but not done defensively. It's being done offensively. So in all of these, the diestro is just kind of standing there, hanging out in right angle, and the common or vulgar fencer is doing something to them. So in this one, he's standing there. The vulgar fencer is going to come in, and he's going to hit the sword up into the air and then cut down with the tajo. So you have 4 different ways to counter this, and they're just varying degrees of steps. The step B is a straight step, so that is on what he calls the rectilinear angle, which is that side of that inscribed square in the circle. So later on, this is something that he'll refer to as a transverse step, but in this instance, he hasn't come up with that terminology yet. So he just says you're taking a straight step on the rectilinear angle and delivering a thrust to the chest, or delivering a thrust. I don't think he specifies where it is. So you could also circle right to point C and give the thrust in the chest. You could circle right to point B and give the tajo to the head, or you can give a small circular step into point E and place a tajo. So I don't know, again, if he's just trying to use different terms, and he decided first he was going to say subject, and then in the next one he was going to say the universal impediment, and then in the third one he says atajo. But that's where we're at. So this would be an atajo on the outside. When they come in to try and beat your sword upward, you just place a tajo on it, and it works because natural movement defeats violent movement all the time, apparently. So I've never had somebody successfully do that, but I'm sure if you're Pacheco, that works. So this is his solution to the arrebatar tajo. Okay, blow to the sword. So this is it's kind of the opposite of the arrebatar tajo, because for the arrebatar, the vulgar fencer comes underneath and knocks the sword up. The blow to the sword is almost like giving a tajo into the sword. So you're just going to come down on top of it, knock it out of the way, and then now that the sword's out of the way, you can, I don't know, thrust or cut or whatever it is that you want to do. The only important part here is that they're trying to knock your sword down into their left, to their inside. So he has his 3 counters here. Again, small step in, thrust to the chest. This has the same rectilinear step to the left and thrust to the chest, and then he's got the revés, point C, and the subjecting with the left hand. So this is a movement of conclusion on point C. He just, again, doesn't use that term. So you step in, subject their sword with your left hand, and give them the revés. All right, so ripping tajo. The ripping tajo, that is, this one's kind of a weird one. So the vulgar fencer, in this instance, is going to raise his sword high over his head and come down with this big tajo, this big cut that reaches all the way to the floor. And when they do it, Pacheco says that their head comes forward and their face is inclined all the way down to the ground. And then if that misses, they come back with the revés coming upward. I've never heard any other author talk about this, just Pacheco. So I don't know what kind of bozos that he was fighting, but apparently they were trying this kind of stuff. So he has a few counters to this. The first 3, A, B, C, and D, right? They are from stepping forward. So C and D come off of B. The first one stepping in before the Tahoe. So as soon as they raise their sword and they're going to do this, you just step straight forward and thrust right into them. Then when the sword comes down and they are attempting to knock that thrust out of the way, then you can do C or D, where you circle to the right and thrust or cut after you've moved your sword and evaded it out of the way. He never talks about what to do if they just don't care and cut you anyway, but I guess that doesn't happen in Pacheco land. That's only something that happens in the real world. So that is C and D, and then E and F are what happens after if you don't step in and thrust before the Tahoe comes. If the Tahoe comes anyway, then you take a step to the left, and you can either give the thrust or the revés.
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We have a question from the audience. Are these branch steps different options, or are they chained together somehow, like in the Iron Gate sequence?
These are options. So actually, this is a good one. So there's options, and then there's chained together. So A to B is the first part, and then C and D are options off of B. But if you don't go to B, then you can do E or F. So it's kind of like choose your own adventure fencing. You know, your opponent comes in with a ripping Tahoe. What do? If you want to step straight in and thrust before the Tahoe comes, you know, go to point B. If you'd like to give a revés to the head, go to point F. You know, that kind of thing. But you can't get to C and D until you go to B. So that's the connections there between them. Okay, so then the last three, he doesn't even give demonstrations for. He just kind of talks about them. And it's not really necessary to give demonstrations for these because of the way that he talks about them and how the counters work. So the blow to the foot is literally what it sounds like, and he's very dismissive of this and basically says, you know, it's not like an awl that's going to puncture my shoe. It's like I'm wearing leather shoes, buddy. You're not gonna hurt my foot. So just stab him in the face, basically, is what he said. The slap and the braçal, for those who aren't familiar, the slap, that's the manotada, which is taking your left hand and hitting their blade out of the way. So if there's somebody pointing their sword at you, you slap it out of the way with your hand, and then you come in to do a thrust or a cut or whatever it is that you want to do. The braçal is very similar, but instead of slapping it with your hand, you're going to come in closer and use your forearm to lift their sword up out of the way. It's called braçal. Braçal means it's a type of armor that's on the arm, so it's kind of like a bracer, but it's not like, you know, limited to the forearm. It can be cover more of the arm. So the idea there is that if you have one of those, and later on he talks, I don't know if it's later, if it's in this book, can't remember, but talks about how sometimes people will secretly wear armor underneath their clothes, or if they can't afford the armor or don't have the armor, they'll just strap some wood to their forearm underneath their clothes so that they can do this braçal. They can take a cut to their arm or whatever, and they don't really care because it's not going to get through their armor. But his counters to these are very simple. It's essentially just, you know, make a whole circle or half circle or whatever, evade what they're doing to your sword and stab them. It's very similar to what he does with the counters to the blow to the sword, because they're essentially the same thing. So the blow to the sword is with their sword, the slap is with their hand, and the braçal is with their forearm. So they're essentially the same techniques, just done slightly differently. So the counters to them are basically the same.
Tim, do you mind if I restate that so I make sure that I understand it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So just to be clear, what I believe you're saying is that as they attempt to take the sword with their hand, you perform a circle with the sword to avoid it, then you could thrust into the opposite line.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe that's it. I didn't pay a lot of attention to these because he kind of buries the counter in a wall of text, which is something that he becomes very good at later. But right now he has a lot of demonstrations in these. He just kind of buried them in the text. So I didn't dig out the counters because for the overall flow of the book, it's not that important. Okay, so then at the end of the third part, he talks about the different weapons. And he asks the question, which one is best? So he very briefly discusses each one. Talks about the shield and what it does, and the buckler and the cloak and the dagger. I didn't recreate it here. I'm not going to talk about it because it's, there's not really much to it. Nothing is revolutionary. It's like, oh yeah, the shield blocks. The buckler does also, that kind of stuff. But he does promise that he will talk about these in a future book, in his second book, in more detail. And I think he does talk more about them in Nueva Ciencia, which was his last book. But it was not, well, he talks about them. So here's a little quiz. Everybody can get their answer mentally in their head, what they think that Pacheco says that the best of these weapons is. And so the answer is the sword alone. Strict question. All those suck, and all you need is the sword. The reasoning that he gives is kind of flimsy, but basically it amounts to, yeah, those are great, but you don't always have a shield with you. You don't always have a buckler. Sometimes you don't even have your cloak or your dagger. So you always have your sword, because your sword is the most faithful companion that man has had, which I think means that Pacheco never had a dog, but that's the answer. Sword is best. You don't need anything other than sword. Then the last thing that he talks about in the third part is the mean of proportion and the proportionate mean. So this is medio de proporción and medio proporcionado. This is kind of interesting because he gives a little bit more detail on what these are. And Carranza does not give detail in his book on what these are. He's very, a lot of things that Carranza talks about is very cryptic. He'll maybe say one thing about it, and then he just kind of goes on. Or he'll talk around something, and then he gives a definition at the end of the book with his big glossary of things. So he does that with the mean of proportion, where he says that it's the same thing as measuring the swords, and that's it. Earlier he talks a little bit about it and how you need to choose the mean of proportion based on the size of the weapons or the size of the opponent and things like that, but never really gives any kind of a detail on it. There's an interesting bit in Carranza's book where that Pacheco cites as he's talking about this, and in the text, I think I have this right, in the text he's talking about the mean of proportion, but the margin note over on the end talks about the proportionate mean. And there's no discussion in the text on that page of the proportionate mean. He's talking about the mean of proportion. So I think my opinion is that even Carranza at that point didn't have a technical terminology built up, and there wasn't hard and fast differentiation between mean of proportion and proportionate mean, which I think is part of why the language is so close and so strangely related. But Pacheco carves them up and says, this is exactly what the mean of proportion is, this is what the proportionate mean is. He gives reasons for the things that he cites in Carranza's book, and it all makes sense. It's not like he's trying to pull the wool over our eyes or anything. It's just that things aren't clear in Carranza's text, and Pacheco makes them clear here. Okay, fourth part on the particular blows of the true Destreza. So this, I laid out the page counts here because this is a lot of the book. So this is about a third of the book here in this fourth part. And of that, the second intention that he shows is the vast majority. So it's the number, there's like a little over 300 numbered folios in the book. So second intention is like about a third of the book. Right? That's a lot of it. So there's no way I'm going through all of it. Not all that important. There's a few things that I want to highlight to just kind of talk about the book a little bit. But this is the way that he structures this fourth part. He has the second intention, and he goes through the first intentions very, very short. Circular techniques, those are, like I said earlier, the cuts. We talked about how to do them. And then parries of cuts, and then, of course, the how to fight against Turks part. So I'm just going to pick out a few of the second intention ones that are kind of interesting. And
Tim,
talk about
I have a question about second intention and the way that Pacheco uses it.
Yes.
So in Carranza, second intention is an awaiting place where you wait for the adversary to act. And in more modern style fencing, what we see in second intention is it's a lot more like a commetimiento where you deliver an attack and then respond to the adversary's defense. Do you have a sense of where Pacheco is using second intention at this time?
Yes. So I'm not sure if he says this or if it's in a part of Carranza that he refers to. But the idea behind second and first intention is that second intention requires another will to act. So it requires someone else's intention in order for the technique or the thing to be what it is. So first intention does not require that. So for instance, anything that like you can do without the other person reacting or initiating anything is first intention. So like Andre's got his Pell, his kind of dummy where he has the fencing mask on it. And if anybody's seen those videos, I like that video. And he talks about how to build it so that he can train by himself, while we're all quarantined. So anything that you could do to that, or you could do to a Pell, would be first intention, because it's not doing anything back to you. Other than that, it would be second intention. So it's not necessarily about waiting. It's about the other party making some sort of action. So it could be that they attack you and you respond to that. That would be second intention. Or it could be that you attack them and they respond to that, and then you go into something else. That's also second intention. So it's like back to the Iron Gate, where there were 4 different things that happen, where they stand in Iron Gate, you thrust at them, they lift their sword to parry, you come underneath and thrust, then they drop their sword to parry, so you come up around and cut, and they lift up to parry that, so you step back and thrust under their sword again. 4 things happen there, but that's all second intention, because the opponent was doing something.
Thanks for that answer. That's just fascinating.
So that's little second actor, right? That's the older sense of second intention.
Yeah. So that's the way I understand it, and that he's talking about it. So there is a second actor there. Somebody is intending to do something, and that's what causes the technique to be formed, as opposed to they're just passive and the other person does what they're going to do to it. And so I think that's why the first intention is so thin, because you can do a few things to them and then that's about it. What else are you going to do? But the second intention is much larger because that creates more interesting scenarios. Okay, so these are the second intention techniques that he lays out in his book. These 9 techniques take up 74 folios, and if you're not familiar with what a folio is, that's a sheet of paper front and back. So this is like 150 pages of his book. And it takes up a lot because he describes it, and then he describes, how they can counter it and what you're going to do when they counter it. And then he talks about what you should do to counter it if they try and do it to you. And sometimes he also says, if you go to do this and then they counter it the way they're supposed to, then this is how you recounter it. But never use the language counter because it's a huge no-no in Destreza, same way you can't call it fencing. It's not a counter, it's an opposition, or it's a formed technique, because there's no such thing as counters in Destreza. So a lot of these names are going to be familiar. And then, so I'm going to zoom in on a few of these just to kind of look at them, because there's some very interesting things in there. The first one they start with is narrowing, or estrecha. Again, Pacheco had not developed his technical vocabulary to the exacting point that he did later on. So a lot of times he uses multiple words to mean the same thing. And this is one of those. So he literally says at the beginning of this, this is the second intention technique of narrowing, or deflecting, or necessitating. And he says uses those all together, and they're kind of interchangeable. So the term narrowing is, well, for anybody who's not familiar with the technique, it's basically a counterclockwise circle that's done with your sword around their sword. So you're enveloping their blade with your blade and moving it down and out of the way. This term exists in Carranza's work, but is not defined as a specific technique. It's more of a concept. So the narrowing or the necessitating, I don't think he calls it deflecting. I don't think Carranza does, but he does equate the estrecha or necesita. So that he defines as something that takes the opponent's sword from the good posture that it's in and moves it to a less good posture. So they're in a good spot, you're just going to move their sword to somewhere where it's in not such a good spot so that you can do what you need to do to them. And this specific technique being called narrowing is something that Pacheco kind of made up. He didn't make up the term, but he did assign it to this specific technique. He does not refer to it as a general technique. It is just a second intention technique. He doesn't have the terminology of these are the 4 general techniques. He just says this is the second intention technique of narrowing, which is also deflecting, which is also necessitating. So
Jim, I have a question about this.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, sometimes we just have to jump in. Is he using narrowing as defensive steel in this point? So is he binding and moving, or is he responding to a threat?
He is binding and moving. So this is not a response to a threat at all. I think all of the second intention that he shows in this, unless it's the opposition to that other thing, is just when the opponent is standing there in right angle, and then you go and do what it is that you're going to do. So the second intention part is that the opponent is standing there, you go to start doing your narrowing, and then they're going to respond to that. And then here's all the branches that you can do off of there. Even though he does sometimes give options where the opponent didn't do anything. So I think that's one of the cases here. It might be so you go step A to B, giving the narrowing, and then when they didn't do anything, you just continue through and give them a thrust into the face or the chest, stepping to point speed on the inside of their sword. It's it's still part of this second intention thing, but the opponent didn't do anything. They just stood there and got stabbed. So I think that's just kind of thrown in as an option to show what the intent is, even though it's not technically second intention. So there's a lot of counters in here. You know, you go to do the narrowing, and then they try and subject your sword, or they try and do this other thing, then you step over here and you do this. I don't want to go through all that because that's not the interesting part. The interesting part to me is this language that he uses to describe it. And then later he gives the counter to this. So when the opponent tries to do the narrowing on you, then you do the narrowing back to him, which will oppose his movement and allow you to defeat them. Or you just simply subject his sword, and then that allows you to cut, thrust, and whatever you like. So the next one is the line and cross, or the linea and cruz. So this one, as you can see from that footwork diagram, there's tons of options that he throws out there. And the initial one is A to B. So B is where the sword is. A is down in the lower right. So it's a circular step to the right again. And this one he calls obligating, which is also the line and cross. And he says specifically that this is the same as narrowing, but it's above. So it's unclear whether he's saying that this fulfills the same function as the technique of narrowing that I showed earlier, or he's saying this is also narrowing, because it is narrowing in the concept that Carranza had introduced it as taking the opponent's sword from somewhere that's good and putting it bad. So it's hard to say which way he means that, but what he does say is it's the same as narrowing, but it's from above instead of below. And the obligating term is pretty interesting. That shows up again later, and occasionally Viedma will talk about obligating their sword. And then the opposition to this is a tajo or thrust by doing a circle to the right. So if you've studied Viedma at all, that's like his big thing. You know, they come to do line and cross against you, just circle right and cut them or stab them. Or he also has circling to the left, which would be circling in the same direction that they're, or toward them on the circle. So if you're facing a right-handed fencer and they go to do line and cross to you, from your perspective, they're going to be moving to the left. You are also going to move to the left, and that will give you the correct angle to subject their sword on the outside. And then you can give, whatever cut or thrust you want after that. Okay, so I normally would blow right past this, but since this group loves the acometimiento, I figured we should talk about it. So this is his perfect acometimiento. So it's acometimiento perfecto al rostro, so it's to the face. And he says specifically in here, it's only perfect if it goes to the face, to the hand or the thigh or something else, no good. But I think that definition is straight out of Carranza. So he says that in order to do this, it has to be done exactly like you were going to wound, so that if you intended to wound them, that you would wound them. But he says that it is and a lot of this he's going back to Carranza and quoting Carranza and citing some of his thoughts in his book. He says that it does not ever wound by itself. It's a movement that allows you to create a wound. So there's something kind of interesting about the terminology here that gets lost in the translation, because it's very strange in English. So I never translate it the way it literally is in Spanish. The word wound. So the word wound is herida, which is something that is frequently used to describe what I translate as a blow. So you get a blow of first intention. Pacheco talks about that in his book and specifically says why the term herida is used, the word wound, because it's named after its effect. So a successful completed blow will cause a wound in the opponent. And so he refers to it as a wound. But it makes the English really weird if you translate it that way, like you throw a wound at this guy, which is kind of odd in English. So generally I just say blow unless wound makes more sense. So sometimes it gets translated as wound. So Carranza says that the acometimiento is a movement that is converted into a thrust or a tajo or revés so that you can wound with it, but it doesn't do it on its own. So he likens it to the zero in math. So the zero has no value by itself, but it gives value to other numbers when it is placed with them. So a 1 is just 1 without the 0. If you put a 0 in there, then it's 10. Even though 0 has no value, being placed in there with it, it now gives that 1 a different value. So that's his talk about it. And he says that you step in, you go to thrust them right in the face. But the one of the important parts of it is says that you do everything as though you were going to wound if you wanted to wound, except for the step. So he says that the step is not too far forward, that it's of the same proportion that you see in the demonstration, which doesn't mean anything because he doesn't give a scale or say that anything is to scale. He just says, here's the step, go straight forward. So it's unclear whether he's saying that you don't step far enough forward in order to wound them, or if he's saying that you do step far enough forward to wound them, but you don't go past what you would need in order to wound them. You know, like if somebody was trying to move backwards, you're trying to evade it, and you were trying to just jam it home as a first intention thrust to the face. So that part's kind of unclear. But what he wants to say is that you step in, thrust into the face, but the intention there is not to wound. They're going to try and defend it, and then you have all of these options. He does, thankfully, give a, he'll frequently throw these little doubts or questions in there, which is like all over Carranza. That's what the whole dialogues are about. You know, somebody makes a point and somebody else brings up something else. Hey, that doesn't make sense to me. So one thing that he throws in here is he says that, you know, you may be looking at this and saying, well, the others, the vulgar or the common fencers also do this. So why is it okay when we do it and not when they do it? And his response is because that when we do it, the opponent's sword is not free. So you're able to feel how they're going to respond and react appropriately. Whereas when the vulgars do it, they don't even care about the other person's sword. They just, you could have your sword pointed at their face, they'll just, you know, feint at your stomach or whatever, and don't care about what's happening with your sword and just rely on their sight to pick it up or whatever. I don't know. That's his fig leaf that he has for why this is okay, is because we're touching their sword and they're not able to do something without us knowing about it, not unsafe. So it has a lot of counters, a lot of follow-ups. You know, you thrust the guy, goes to parry, and then can branch off to C, D, E, whatever, all these different ones. But one that's very interesting, I thought, was the path to E. So this is what happens if you come in and you do the acometimiento and they try to wound you. So you start coming forward with a thrust and they don't care, they just thrust right back into you. Then his response is circular step and subject to sword. So the acometimiento isn't always, I'm going to attack or I'm going to thrust, and they are going to defend. He does have a spot in here where he says they may just stab right back at you, and then here's what you do: circle right and subject the sword, which is generally his response for everything. Circle right and subject the sword. Any questions about that? There's a little bit more, but I wanted to make sure everybody's following or anybody doesn't have anything to ask.
Tim, I have a question as we watch the way that Pacheco is using language in this. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we might be able to create an argument that Pacheco is, in a lot of ways, the real originator of a lot of the technical language that we use in Destreza, and it sort of feels like he's feeling his way through that language and figuring out where the pieces fit. We don't have any proof of that, but I just wanted to get your take on it.
I think that's 100% correct. Because what he says early on about Carranza's book and about why he wrote this book and everything is that, you know, Carranza gave theory but didn't give any practical demonstration. And so this was kind of grew out of his notes from studying Carranza's books. And so I don't think he decided, this is the way that it should be, like he did later on. He was just kind of like throwing his ideas down. And I think personally for me, the earlier Destreza, the way that Carranza talks and some of this stuff that Pacheco is putting out there, it's not dogmatic. It's very much, here's a philosophy, here's an idea, make sense and fit into this in order to be true. But it's not specific as to how you do that or techniques that you need to do in order to make that happen. So what Pacheco's presenting here to me is, hey, here's my take on it. Here's what I think that this is like. And later on it becomes, okay, I'm right, everybody else is wrong. But right now it's, here's an idea on how you could take the things that Carranza is talking about in his book, and you could make it practical. You can use it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I find this part of your talk just fascinating and really interesting.
Yeah, so that's a lot of what I've been looking into recently. Anybody's been waiting for the next part of the translation to come out. Sorry, I got down a rabbit hole with this, because I'm looking at the things that he's putting together and the way that he talks about things, and I'm like, well, that's not right. That's weird. So I started trying to jump back into reading things in Carranza that he's citing or other things in there and just digging through, and so I completely lost track of what was going on. And yeah, it's really really very interesting because most of the time people get the kind of finalized, at least for an author, this is the way that Destreza is, and so people will say, well, this is what it is. Like, no, it existed for hundreds of years and it evolved as it went. And at the beginning, it was not like Carranza just, everybody wants a translation of Carranza, and as anybody who's read it or Lois can tell you, it's not going to give you anything technical in there. People think, okay, I want to know what Destreza is, so I need to read Carranza. Like, yeah, but you don't know what you're asking for. It's not, these are the rules, this is what you do, this is how you do it. Because that wasn't the point that Carranza was trying to put out there. And so it's kind of should be, to me, again, this is me personally, to me it should be very, very much free form. As long as you can, it's kind of like the rules for Montante. As long as you follow those rules, there can be various interpretations depending on how a person reads it and how they interpret it. As long as they're not going against what's said in the rule, it's fine. That's a valid interpretation. So it's the same kind of thing with Destreza to me. So as long as you follow the philosophy and the path of things that are laid out in what Carranza says, or you can use science to justify what you're doing or whatever, that's Destreza. You know, it doesn't have to be following Pacheco. It doesn't have to be this is what the movement of conclusion is, or these are the 4 general techniques, and you know, these are the dignities of the techniques that Edenhard put together. It's all of that stuff is just the option, you know. So that's why I dig into some of the earlier stuff to kind of tease out what Destreza could have been before Pacheco kind of tried to crystallize it and kill all the variations of it. And I think that kind of plays out a little bit later with Edenhard and Rivera when they talk about the Italians. And so they will say that, you know, it's good fencing, it's good Destreza basically, but there's a few mistakes they made, which is why you shouldn't do it that way. But the idea is that they follow. It's not just random chance. It's study. It's science. It's making sure that you're safe and everything is done correctly. Okay, so running late. Okay, I'll try and blow through the rest of this stuff pretty quickly. These 3 right here represent counters to the acometimiento that Pacheco gives. So the top center is a revés to the opponent. So when he shows the counters, or the non-counters, the oppositions, or whatever he calls them, the demonstrations are a little bit different. So now the 2 concentric circles are the diestro, because the technique is being done to him. That's the target. So the spot over on the left where it says pie, that's foot, that's where your feet are. It's not pie, like it looks like in English, which makes me think of pie every time I see this. But the movement there is from where you started, the opponent came in to do the acometimiento, and you are going to move to where those circles are. So the top center one is crazy to me. The opponent comes in, does the acometimiento, and you are going to make a circular step to the left with your left foot, and you are going to subject their sword with your left hand and give them a revés to the head. So they come in to make a acometimiento, and you just shoot right in and do a movement of conclusion and revés to the head. But that's Pacheco. He can do that stuff. Lower left is a thrust. So you are going to just, they come in to do the acometimiento, and you just thrust right back into them, move slightly to the right, and make sure that the swords stay off to your left, and then thrust into them. He doesn't say the hand position on this one, but if your both swords are over to your left and you're thrusting forward, it's going to be pretty difficult to do that with the nails in or the sword on edge. So you're probably going to turn them to be nails up, which is very much vulgar. Right? That's like Godinho talks about that all the time. That's thrusting by the same edges.
The first one seems like it's like it would be against a feint to the inside, and the second one against a feint to the outside.
Right. I don't think they are. I think they're all counters to the same thrust, all to the inside. And then the very last one is just subjecting the sword. So the lower right, that's circle step to the right, subject the sword, and then you can, you know, cut or thrust, however you like. So I just wanted to throw those in there and highlight them because I know people like the acometimiento. Okay, then the next one, so there's only one more after this that I want to look at, but this is the weak below the strong. So he also refers to this as obligating, even though he referred to the line and cross as also as obligating. Again, these are not general, so these aren't general techniques. These aren't one of his 4 general techniques. And when he describes this, he describes it the same way that Viedma talks about the weak below the strong. So It's simply a circular step to the right from A to B, and you place the tip of your sword below the strong of their sword. And that's it. That's this technique of weak below the strong. You have a lot of options depending on what they do from there. But the thing that people are used to, that general technique of weak below the strong, where you start with line and cross and you continue circling through until you kind of do an expulsion of their sword off to the inside. That's not what this one is. This is just moving over and placing your tip underneath their strong of their sword.
So, Tim, can I bug you on this one?
Yeah.
Seems really strange to me for a Pacheco action, because he doesn't tend to like invitations, but this, to me, looks like a contact invitation. Where he's asking you to do something.
He does say that this is okay, and you can do this because of the step that you make and where you, the distance that you have. He's not able to wound you because he wants you to take a actual literal circular step along the circle. And by doing so, this is one of his ridiculously large 6-foot steps along the circle where you basically go a quarter of the way around the circle. And by doing that, then they're not able to actually wound you. And then when they go to move, then you have your follow-up back.
So this is a little bit like the same way that he invites an attack to the arm in the counters to the Vulgars by using a weak under strong in the air.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is another one of those things where you look at it and you go, come on, Pacheco, that's like, you're being kind of dishonest there. Especially when you look at the opposition that he gives to this. So when somebody does the weak under strong to you, you can subject their sword, you can step off to the left and thrust them since they're making that large circular step in that direction. You can obligate them in return, which is something that Viedma has. One of his basic drills is to just go back and forth doing that weak under strong obligation as you circle to the right. But the very interesting one is the acometimiento, or arremeter aéreo, which is to put yourself into wound, like go forth to wound them. So he uses these terms both in their verb and their noun form interchangeably in this section. So sometimes he will say acometimiento, sometimes he will say acometer a herir, which is to go to attack to wound, or he'll say arremeter a herir, which is to go into the wound. So he uses those as an opposition when they give you this kind of invitation, which again, this goes back to his counter to the inviting that the Vulgar does, where he just steps forward and thrusts anyway, even though that's what they want. So one of his basic follow-ups is he gives the weak under strong, and then when they come in and try and attack, here's all the things that you can do to them. But then his opposition to, one of the oppositions to the weak under strong is go in to attack them. So it's just another one of those things where Pacheco is kind of inconsistent with the way that he applies things. You have this kind of strange readiness where you can know their movements and therefore it works for you but doesn't work for them. Okay, and so then the last one here is the weak above the strong, or the weak over strong. It's also, he calls it obligated. So 3 of his 4 general techniques that he talks about later, now he's referring to them all as obligating, which is pretty interesting. But you'll notice, those of you with sharp eyes will notice that as I go back and forth between these 2 slides, they're almost identical. The difference is whether the point is over to the top or underneath, but the foot paths are the same. So there's not a whole lot that's interesting here. It's just kind of interesting the way that he refers to it as obligating as well as the other things. And he does have doing the same obligation in return to them, the same way that he does the weak under. When they do the weak under, you can go back to do the weak over, or you can go into a subjection. and that allows you to then do what you're supposed to do. He has the same idea here that this large circular step is what keeps you safe. So this isn't it's not a bad thing to do because of the position and the distance that you have, and you gain degrees of the profile, and so it's okay. So that is, oh, geez, that's just second intention. Okay, run through these first intention ones pretty quickly. So he only has 3 first intention techniques that are rough, because he separates the cuts out separately. He has a blow above the sword or by the edges, which both of those are just straight thrusts. The above the sword is kind of what it sounds like. You're just thrusting along their sword, but make sure that you go over the top of it with your nails in position. And then the thrust by the edges, that's thrusting in on the inside. I talked about that in my previous lecture, where he says, yeah, this works because you're fast and you're good. So it's fine. And then subjecting and wounding, that's with a circular step to the right. You subject their sword on the inside, and then you can do Tahoe, or you can do a thrust. So he puts that in with first intention because it doesn't require the opponent to actually do anything. You just move over. Even though you're not going directly into an attack, you are still the only one acting. So you make your subjection, and then you come in and wound. Then his circular techniques and parries, they're not terribly interesting, except for his first intention cuts. He describes the cuts, the Tahoe and Revés, but with this, he talks about how to do them in first intention, which I can describe kind of briefly. You don't just walk forward and cut the person, or even circle and cut the person. They always go through the opponent's sword. So with the first intention Tahoe, you're going to circle to the right, subject their sword, come off of that, and do a cut. For the first intention Revés, that one's kind of interesting because you come basically underneath their sword and lift it with your hilt. And when you come forward, that allows you to subject their sword with your left hand and circle left and give the Revés to the head. So the first intention of Revés is a movement of conclusion into the Revés. And you get into that by jamming their sword upward from underneath and cutting. The parries against the cuts are very similar to that. It's kind of a bait and switch. He talks about parries, then he doesn't really describe parries. He basically says that before there's a lot of justification philosophically on why you do it this way, but before the natural motion of the cut actually occurs, before it starts, you have to get in there and put your sword against their sword, and therefore they won't have any strength and everything's fine. So that's how he parries a cut, is when they lift their sword up to do something, you just kind of rush forward and jam your sword into their sword, and therefore it's parried, and then they can't cut you. And the very last part of the fourth part, last bit in the fourth part, is how to defeat Turks. This is also translated. I don't remember who translated it, but it's available out on the web somewhere in English. And there's not a whole lot to it. He basically says that the Turks will stand this way, and they will make faces and try and scare you and scream, and all they ever do is one of two things. They will either cut downward with their sword into you as they're screaming, or they will cut downward into your sword as they're screaming, and then they can come and cut you again. So virtually every counter that he has in here, every opposition that he has in here, is just evade with a small circle of your sword and stab them. So the very first one is that step forward. Because they're standing in that posture, you just run up and thrust at them. If they come down and try and hit your sword, then you evade it. Step to one of these other directions. There's probably a movement of conclusion in there or something. It's very, very dismissive of the skill or aptitude of Turks So it's not terribly interesting. Okay, fifth part, and this is the last part. There's just a few slides here. So this is where he talks about the universal in the fifth part. So these 8 points that he puts in are what he says you need to know in order to understand the universal, so then you can not fence, but you can, you know, do your sword play by the universal and not through particulars. So the first one is exercise. You need to be exercised. You can't be frail and not do anything, and you also need to train. You can't just sit around and read books and talk theory and actually understand how to do any kind of sword fighting. You have to actually train this stuff. The reason for fighting, that's basically, there's nothing new in there, nothing that you wouldn't expect. It's, you know, don't go around picking fights, don't kill people for no reason, be a good Christian, have honor, stuff like that. Kind of a cribbed version of Carranza's whole last dialogue, where he talks about all the ways when you're justified in fighting and killing lives and things like that. Number 3 is knowing the complexions or the temperaments of people, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in the next slide. 4 is pretty interesting because it's the nature of the 4 movements, and the 4 movements, if you're used to Destreza, you are used to the 6 movements. Those 6 movements didn't quite exist in that form at this point. So there are only 4 movements. You have the violent movement, which is upward, natural movement, which is downward, the remiss or the offline movement, which is to the side, and then you have mixed, and that's it. Those are your 4 movements. And so, for instance, he talks about how a cut, a tajo hendido, which is a cleaving cut, like just a downward, or altibajo, same thing, would be composed of 2 movements. So you have the violent, where you go straight up, and then the natural, where you come straight down. But a proper circular tajo would be 4 movements, and so that would be natural, where you drop the tip, remiss, or the offline, where you're moving it off to your side. So if you're a righty, you're moving it to your left side. Violent, where you lift it into the obtuse angle, and then natural, where it comes down to wound. So those are the 4 movements that they have. The accidental, or the forward and the backward movements, the accidental and extraño, those do exist. Pacheco talked about them, Carranza talked about them, but they're not a part of these movements. They're kind of separate for whatever reason. I'm not quite sure. They discuss them. They talk about the accidental movement of the thrust. They talk about the backward movement, the extraño, to move the sword backward, but they're not considered these 4 essential movements in Destreza at this point. So you've got the violento, natural, the remiso, and mixto. Those are your 4 movements that are important. Number 5 is touch. So this is, there's nothing revolutionary here. It's basically what you would expect. So having contact with the other person's sword and being able to feel the movements that they make with that, or being able to feel what they can do, that's very important, and you have to be able to do that. That makes sense. Yeah, tacto is the term. Conservation of breath. Again, there's nothing revolutionary in there. Don't run out of breath, because then it's hard to do things. So make sure you've exercised so you don't run out of breath easily, and conserve your breath while you're fighting so you don't tire yourself. But there are some kind of funny little gems in there that have to do with philosophy at the time. So, like he says that air is light, and so if you take in a deep breath, you then become lighter, so it makes jumping easier. So next time you guys are jumping, keep that in mind. Take in a deep breath, and then you'll float a little bit, apparently, according to Pacheco, and you can jump farther. Number 7, the effects of the universal. This is kind of what I've been hinting at the whole time, that by following these points and your training should lead toward a universal way of fencing, so that nothing that you deal with, you don't want to deal with the particulars. Science deals with the universal. If you just deal with particulars, you learn tricks or you learn certain things to do in certain situations, then you can be caught in novel situations and not have any idea what to do. If you learn how to use the universal, then even though a situation is novel to you, you're never disturbed by it. It never bothers you because you understand the movements, you understand the different complexions of people, you understand how to step and how to use touch, and you can conserve your breath. So all of this will enable you to deal with any situation, no matter what's occurring. So that's the effect of the universal. And then the last one is the 5 paths, and those are steps that you can take, the paths that your steps can go down. And I'll go into a little more detail on that stuff. So the complexion, so this is how you recognize it. This is your secret decoder ring for how to know the different temperaments that people have, or the time of year that that particular humor will rule over that time of year or that time of day or that age of a person. And so, this is, he recognizes that there are mixes, like temperaments, of these different complexions that people have. So you're not necessarily just choleric. You could be like a choleric sanguine or whatever, and so you would need to know that. But the bit on the bottom is kind of the opposite of earlier when he said this is how you should teach somebody at first. This is what he's saying how you should defeat that person. So for the choleric, for instance, atajo is what you need. That's the thing that's going to help the most. And by being able to determine, the time of year, the time of day, whatever, what the person looks like, you'll know all of this stuff, so then you'll understand. So if you see a bald guy who's very animated and it's summer in the middle of the day and he's in his late 20s, early 30s, you better have that atajo ready to go, because you know for certain this guy's going to do that. That's what he's talking about here. It's kind of interesting if you're into that, but apparently he thinks that this is very important for you to be able to fence and kind of know the personality of your opponent. Okay, so then the 5 paths, these are interesting because he puts them in here and he puts a lot of stock in them, and they don't really show up again elsewhere. And this is one of the things, like Carmona specifically calls him out on this and says, these are garbage and nobody uses these. It's fuck, why'd you invent this? And the demonstration here is showing these 5 paths, so A, B, C, D, and E. And the lines have little hash marks on them, and they have the numbers next to them. That's the number of feet in that step. So A is 2 feet long, B is 3, and so forth until you get to E, which is 6 feet. So it's E, the 5th path is a 6-foot circular step. The numbers at the top, on that top line, are the distance from the diameter that each step should be. So the first one, the first path, is a half a foot off the diameter. And then the second one is 1 foot, and then 2, 3, and 4. So 4 feet off the diameter, 4 feet is the length of the radius of this circle. So that 6 feet around and 4 feet off the diameter is pretty much a quarter of the circle. So he wants you to be able to step from one spot in the circle all the way, a quarter of the way around to the other part of the circle in one step, which is something that later on people go, this is ridiculous. How the hell do we do this? You know, even accounting for the fact that you can't actually make a circular step, it has to be on that rectilinear angle that he's talking about. It's 6 foot curve, so it's like 5.5 if on a direct path. Even then, 5.5, that's a pretty big step, you know, even for someone who's, you know, normal height, which would be, you know, the normal feet. You have to really just kind of float your way over to that other spot. And this is one of those things that people say, like, this is ridiculous, Pacheco. You really want me to make a 6 foot step? And later on, some of the apologists come along and say, well, here's how you could do that, or what, and then invent the proportional mean and various other things. But this came about kind of interesting, but I don't want to dwell on it. It came about because of earlier when I was talking about his attempt to link stepping into the science of stepping and measuring things by steps. So that's how he came up with 6 feet. It's a double step, the longest that can be made. But double step doesn't mean take 2 steps. It means it's double the size of the single step. So he still wants you to be both feet together or close to together, and then right foot moves 6 feet off to that side, and then left foot follows, and then plants right there. So he breaks down in the book how each path fits particular techniques that he's talked about earlier. So he'll say, you know, path number 5, this is the one that's good for the universal subjection. It's good for weak under strong, weak over strong, stuff like that. Path number 3 is good for the narrowing or whatever, you know, I'm just making stuff up at this point. But it basically equates to the first 2 paths are first intention, and the other 3 are all various second intention techniques. He says that C, the third path, is basically good enough, but each successive path out just makes you safer. But that's a basic breakdown on his path. And then he ends the book by finally discussing the degrees of strength of the sword, which he gets from Carranza. And then he has a demonstration of the atajo, and he uses atajo this time as the term for the third path and the fourth path and the fifth path. So the one that's shown there is the third path, because it's a 4 foot step that's being taken there. And you move to the right and you place the atajo on the inside of their sword. And then there's various other things that you can do depending on how they react to that, but it's not worth going into. So that's it. Finally, we made it through the book. Does anybody have any questions? Kind of late.
I have a question about a Tahoe.
Yeah.
In a lot of places, a lot of authors talk about the Tahoe being taken, you know, close to middle of the blade, like not like super strong on super weak, right? So what's your experience with how that applies into tactics or things that they do? Because it seems like we always end up with people coming a lot closer than that, right? It's actually a little bit hard to stay far away and maintain control of the sword.
Right. Yes, I think I don't recall him mentioning that specifically, except when he talks about the weak over strong, because and the weak under strong, because those, like, technically, if you look at it, like, oh, if you do the weak under strong, you're putting your 0.1 on his 0.8 or whatever.
Right.
So technically, he's got a Tahoe on the sword, right? But he doesn't really discuss any of that. When he talks about subjecting the sword, he talks about the degrees of strength of the sword and making sure that, you know, it's equal or greater. But there's not a whole lot of discussion that I saw about how far that should be. But when he does the Tahoe by the different paths, they're going to be farther successively from the sword. So it's going to be very difficult to do it with the same part of the sword in all of those positions, because it's not just distance from the diameter, it's also distance that you've taken toward the sword. So it's not very detailed, and again, he talks about that stuff at the end of the book, and I kind of skimmed the end of the book. I didn't read it in detail yet. So if
You can
that's
cover that
wrong,
in your next
I'll
lecture.
dig that out. Huh?
Cover that in your next lecture.
Yeah, there we go. So if that's wrong, I can pull that out and talk about it. You know, I'll post it somewhere and say, hey, I found this thing. So if you read the lecture, I was wrong about this thing. But most of the depictions that he has when he's subjecting the sword is middle to middle. And the only thing I remember specifically about it is him talking about the degrees of strength and, you know, equal or greater.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question from Tim Rivera in the audience. No, this is from
guy.
Yeah, he's a good guy. This is from Caden, and he wants to know specifically about the three considerations: the timing, context, proprio, appropriato, transferido. When he's talking about moving offline with obligar, necessitar, with what will later become the generals, does he bring the timing, the three considerations into that discussion?
No, those don't exist in this book. I don't remember exactly when those, it might be in the Sin Conclusiones, but they're definitely in Moro Fácil. But the proprio, appropriado, and transferido don't exist yet in Pacheco's lexicon for this book. He does talk about before, during, and after, but he doesn't give a whole lot. It's more definitional, you know, so if people aren't sure what he means by the term before something, during something, and after something, then he kind of talks about what it means. But it's pretty basic. I think he gets a little bit into, hey, this is confusing because the Aristotelian notion of time is tied to movement. So how do you do something before or after? But it's from a modern standpoint, it's a pretty basic definition of before, during, and after something.
I did just crack open a copy of 100 Conclusions, and it does have the usage of the conclusion in it, movement of conclusion, and it has appropriato, transferido, and proprio in there. So,
okay, good.
And that's my date says 1608 on that one.
Yeah, I think 1608 was the first publication of that, and it continued into like the 20s, I think, in various ones. The transcription, the critical edition that the AGA put out is, you know, it's got that whole tree of all the different uses of it, or all the different editions that came out. But I'm pretty sure 1608 was the first.
So I have a question about this, because we're looking at the development of the technical language, but it's like he's developing these ideas from Carranza, and he's starting to figure out his language. Then 100 Conclusions, things are much more mature. We get to modo facile, and that's his pitch to be maestro mayor. So the language is suddenly really locked in at that point. Do you have any thoughts on that process?
Not about that specifically. I mean, to me, like I kind of talked about a little bit before, with this book especially, it was kind of his first crack at it. And I don't know anything about what changed between this and the other one. I don't know if maybe some of what, because he talks about how he's been studying and arranging this stuff for the past 10 years before he published it. So a lot of these ideas might be, old, and like by this point, like 8 or 9 years old, that he had come up with. And so then by the time that Sin Conclusiones came out, it was, 15 years or so of his life from the one to the other. So a lot of the stuff that's in this book is kind of a rambling mess. And like I said, it's a very long book. There's a lot to it. So with his later books, like Sin Conclusiones and the Motofacio, they're very short. They're focused. And so I think it is more of a distillation of his ideas, and probably his work trying to sort through it and come to something that's a little bit more succinct, rather than a 700-page book where he talks about everything under the sun and just tries to distill it down to things that are a little bit more concrete.
Can you remind me of Viedma's date on this? Where does he land? It sounds like he's drawing off of Grandeza and not anything from New Science.
Who's that?
Where does Viedma land in the timeline?
So Viedma published in 39, which would be almost 40 years after this was published. And he refers back to this, and he refers to this as Pacheco's book, even though Pacheco had already written and published Sin Conclusiones and the compendium of Carranza and Motofacio and all of that. And it's kind of funny because Viedma says in writing his book, nobody has written a book about how to teach this art. But Pacheco's last book, well, not necessarily the last book, because he had some arguments with Carmona on some other things, but had written a book that was the new and easy way to examine the maestros. So it's to me, it's kind of like a little dig. It's like, that doesn't show you how to teach. That's garbage. And so he's pointing back to Grandezas. Nueva Ciencia didn't get published, as far as I know, until pretty late. I think in the 60s or the 70s. So it was well after Viedma. It was known that a book like that exists because it wasn't referenced by name, but some other authors have talked about Pacheco's other book, like his big book. So I don't know if it was like it's something that had been seen or something that was just talked about and known until it finally got published. But the contents of it, I don't know how much that was known. So Viedma in particular is very much toward this book. But I would call Viedma, even though he talks glowingly about Pacheco and follows his stuff, to me Viedma is a Carrancista. He follows Carranza, even though he uses a lot of things that Pacheco kind of came up with, and he refers back to Pacheco's book a lot. And you see that also with Carmona, because Carmona talks about some of these techniques. Like he'll talk about line and cross and stuff. And that's not something that was in Carranza's book. So Pacheco's first work, and him in general, was so profound that even the people who disagreed with him, who didn't think he was doing things right, still used his terminology, his way of talking about things, and that, you know, these things that he talks about, oh, he's not doing them right, but they still, there wasn't a technical language for how to discuss Destreza until Pacheco came along and put it down in grandezas, and even then, like, it was still kind of fluid. So there's a lot of kind of discussions and things about, like, Cristóbal de Cala, he was another Carrancista who wrote in 1640, I think, or 1641, one of the two. But when he talks about, like, what we would call the generals, he calls them fools. So this is, you know, the rule of weak below strong, or the rule of the line and cross. So he's not using exactly the same terminology, but he's using very similar terminology. So that's, to me, part of why this book, this Grandezas, is so important, regardless of which flavor or whatever of Destreza that you practice. It was so foundational that, love him or hate him, like, it's important to understand how Destreza evolved, because it was a cornerstone of what Destreza became. It was, like I said, his other books were, except for Nueva Ciencia, were fairly short. They were concise. They had more defined and strict terminology in them. But this was his book for, you know, decades. This was his book. This was his work. The rest of it was kind of supplemental to that, and this was the important one. Now, like I said, other authors would refer to this as the book that Pacheco wrote. You know, they weren't talking about en conclusiones or modo fácil or anything like that. They're talking about grandezas. And even though it's kind of wonky and there's some strange terminology and things that seem odd if you look at later Destreza, it's like I said at the very beginning, it's hard to overstate the importance of the book.
I just love how you put that together. Yeah, no, it's good. We have another question from the chat. This is a technical question. Flequeisa debajo de la fuerza and General Baja, where do you go from there with the weak under strong? And if I'm mangling the Spanish pronunciation, you can check in the chat to see it.
So what's the question? Go from where?
Florentina, why don't you unmute and ask it?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was asking, once you gain distance with that movement, what do you do afterward?
With the weak under strong?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
When you're out of the
So that, okay, I understand now. Yeah. Okay. So from there, you typically are far enough around in the circle that you can actually reach. So once you've gained that distance and you've placed your sword in that position, if the opponent does nothing, then you are going to either just move your sword over to thrust into their chest, or you could continue the circular movement through with the tajo. So you're essentially just moving over there and putting your sword in that position. To me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to actually just put your sword into the weak under strong. It's kind of odd, which is, I think, why Viedma doesn't do it. He has his low general, the General Baja, where he comes over like the line and cross and then comes under. Pacheco eventually comes to the same thing, but still refers to it as the flaqueza debajo de la fuerza. So it's moving their sword into that position, and then you gain the degrees of the profile so that you can freely attack and not have to worry about control controlling their sword as you do it. So one of the two basic ways that Carranza talks about how you work your technique is one is by the posture of the sword, where you kind of circle to your left, or you go into their sword, control their sword so that you can thrust or cut or do the conclusion or whatever. And then it's by the profile of the body, where you're going to move out, gain degrees of the profile, and then you can wound freely without having to worry about their sword coming at you. Did that answer the question? Okay, great.
Any other questions from the chat? We'll take a minute. Tim, I know you think that you went long, but I'm not sure that we would have done any justice to the book by cutting it shorter. I think you did a really good job of it.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
All right, I think that concludes our chat and our lecture for the night. So, Tim, thank you so much for taking us through this and spending the time developing this presentation. I think it's been really useful.